Welcome to Im Tirzu's Zionist Saloon. I am Eytan Meir, and I'm very pleased to be joined with Naomi Kahn, the Director for the International Division for Regavim, a fantastic and very important organization that is on the forefront of protecting Israel's lands. Naomi, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for inviting me.
So before getting into what Regavim does to resolve all these issues, could you please start by giving us a background information about what's the main problem, what's going on with the Palestinian Authority's illegal building in Area C, Judea and Samaria?
Well, it's a big piece of work to discuss. It's a very huge challenge. I'll give you a tiny bit of background about Regavim so that you can understand how we do what we do, and then we'll move into that specific area. So Regavim is a fieldwork-based organization. We do both collection of data, analysis of the data, and mapping of what we find out on the ground. We take a step back, connect the dots, see what picture emerges, and then from there try to influence policy of the government of Israel, and as a result, international attitudes and activities in and towards Israel. So we divide the country up into regions, and one of our regions is Judea and Samaria. And what we find in Judea and Samaria is tremendously upsetting, tremendously disturbing, tremendously challenging. What we found in terms of the overlap between Im Tirzu's work and our work is that the European Union and European governments and a host of foreign NGOs are actively involved in severe violations of Israeli sovereignty and Israeli law and international law. We find that the Palestinian Authority has a very, very clear, well-publicized and extremely systematic program for annexation of Area C, which was launched in 2008 by Fayad, who at the time was the Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority. Anyone who wants to see it can go online and look it up. It's called Ending the Occupation, Establishing the State, and it set out a very systematic outline for how to create a state of Palestine. And one of the basic tenets was that Area C would be annexed de facto, without any negotiation, without any international involvement in peace processes, etc., etc. Rather, all the focus would be placed on creating facts on the ground in Area C and taking advantage of the situation that exists in terms of the vacuum of law and Israel's hesitance to behave like a sovereign, and create facts on the ground and de facto annex this territory as the basis for a Palestinian state. And since 2008, they've been doing that.
Do you mind just explaining quickly what is Area C? You know, we hear the A, B, C, D, E. What's the significance of Area C?
So all of these, the alphabet soup we call it, relates really to a framework that was created under the Oslo framework. In 1995, an interim agreement was created in which the Palestinian Authority was created and then was given jurisdiction over certain areas of the disputed territory known as Judea and Samaria, sometimes erroneously called the West Bank in international parlance. The area that was beyond the armistice lines that was liberated by Israel in 1967. So this area was divided into three sections. Area A was placed solely under Palestinian Authority jurisdiction. These are the urban centers, the largest population centers of Arabs in Judea and Samaria. Area B are the more rural concentrations of Arab populations, villages, that sort of thing. And they are more or less, let's call them islands, within the larger area called Area C, which is about 60% of Judea and Samaria, which was placed under Israeli jurisdiction. So the Palestinian Authority, when it released the Fayad Plan, took for granted the fact that they already had full control of areas A and B and focused all of its efforts on Area C, which were placed under Israeli jurisdiction. Now, under international law, no matter which way you look at it, no matter how you consider Israel's presence in this area, under international law, under the Geneva Conventions, the only people who have the right or the responsibility to issue building permits and to decide who uses the land and other resources in Area C of Judea and Samaria is the government of Israel. In order to do that, the civil administration was created. It is an arm of the military, and that automatically creates all sorts of challenges because a military organization doesn't create policy. It doesn't have a vision for the future. It doesn't have a mandate to decide what is best, what is in the best interests of the Jewish people, of the state of Israel. What it does is try to keep the peace. And so in order to keep the peace, for years, it has been turning a blind eye to illegal activity on the part of the Palestinian Authority that is funded, massively funded, by foreign interests.
Talking about the European Union, European governments, so you're saying they actually fund all the buildings. They know what they're doing. They're not hiding the ball. It's very clear.
Would you like me to show you the plan?
I would love to.
I actually have a copy right here. Anybody who's interested can download it from the internet. Here's a copy. I just downloaded it from the internet and put it in a binder.
Establishing the state.
This is the Fayad Plan, and it set out the vision. So now, how do you turn this vision of creating a state unilaterally into actual practice on the ground? Here it is. This is a 2017 document. You can download this from the internet too. This is spatial plans for Palestinian communities in Area C. In other words, this is how systematically the Palestinian Authority is building Palestine in Area C. And what you see here are specific plans for each and every area of Area C, the places where there are Jewish communities and the places where there is Israeli state land. They simply plan Palestinian communities right on top of them with complete disregard for our presence or existence. And on each and every one of these plans, it tells you what part of it is Israeli state land, what part of it is in Area C, what part of it is, and it also tells you, and here's the kicker, which foreign government is funding this project. So each and every project that is in here is systematically carried out. The planning, the funding, the protection in Israeli courts for this illegal activity is each one funded by a different European government or a consortium of governments and the European Union itself. No one's hiding it. It's not as if the Israeli government can't possibly figure this out by itself. Go on the internet, download the plans, and see every single day. You will know, according to this, where the bulldozers are going to be, where the steamrollers are going to be, where they're going to be pouring cement. And what we try to do with both monitoring and constant letter writing to the civil administration, and when necessary, taking exemplar court cases to the Supreme Court, is to force the Israeli government to do its job, to stop this from happening.
And what's the excuse? So you guys know it's very obvious this is a clear violation of every agreement, every international agreement. You see that they're doing this illegal building. Mm-hmm. What's the response of the courts, of the government, of the civil administration? What do they say?
It goes from the ridiculous to the more ridiculous. Let's put it that way. When we first find work on the ground, we go to the civil administration, we file a complaint, we file an alert, we tell them this is what's happening. On state land just outside, we give them exact GPS coordinates, we show them photos, we show them maps, we show them drone images, and generally the answer we get is this canned response that says, we're aware of the situation and we will enforce the law according to our priorities, according to standard enforcement priorities. And we got this answer time and time and time again. We went to the courts when actually things failed to progress. Very often demolition orders are issued but not enforced, or they do some sort of cosmetic little demolition, but the larger construction continues. And the Europeans who are in charge of each of these projects pay for legal representation in the courts. So they can drag a situation through the court for a decade. And then when the court finally says, well, at this point, 10 years down the line, it's an old structure, so we can't really demolish it. Mm-hmm. So it's a game of cat and mouse. The Supreme Court, even in cases where it says, yes, this is illegal, yes, it has to be torn down, yes, they are in violation of demolition orders, will also say, we will not dictate to the military enforcement priorities. So we asked them, what are the priorities for enforcement? They evaded the question. We eventually had to sue them in court to get a list of what those enforcement priorities are so that we could understand and try to point out the ridiculousness of this situation. So, of course, What do you think is the very top of the list of enforcement priorities in Judea and Samaria? When a Jew builds something without a permit, that is the number one priority for demolition. And Arab construction is way down the bottom of the list. But even with all of this, we managed to alert the government. It took years, particularly when we were talking about the E1 area, the very, very strategically crucial area just east of Jerusalem. We call it the Adumim region. And we saw, you can see it now, I mean, go through and you'll see some 85 clusters of illegal construction, all of it with EU symbols on the sides of the buildings in order to claim diplomatic immunity. We finally got the government of Israel to confront the European Union about this illegal construction, a gross violation of Israeli sovereignty. So at the time, Federica Mogherini, who was essentially the foreign minister in charge of the situation here, the EU's representative here in this region, gave an EU commitment to desist from future illegal construction in E1. Now, that's very, very carefully worded for a reason. What we found afterwards is that they took all of the resources they were pouring into illegal construction and they used them for the same purpose using a different tactic, which is even worse. And that tactic is agricultural land grabs. Taking advantage of the system of law that's in force in Judea and Samaria, which, as you know, is not Israeli law. It is essentially based on Ottoman land law. There's some mandatory law. There's some Jordanian property law. But in general, it's questions of ownership of property are based on completely outdated and ridiculous Ottoman land law, which the Ottoman Empire itself tried to reform over 100 years ago, but ran out of time before it was disbanded. So this system of law says that if you use a piece of land for agricultural purposes for a certain amount of time, it can no longer be considered state land. If no one objected, it's essentially yours. So the Palestinian Authority, with the funding of the European NGOs, governments, and the EU itself, has invested in what it calls humanitarian aid. Of course, everything is humanitarian aid, and created a massive problem for the state of Israel that has already cost us hundreds of thousands of dunams of state land. They simply plant trees on it and go away. And if no one does anything about it, that land can no longer, it's simply removed from Area C, and it becomes Area B or Area A, and it's lost to us. So they're using the same resources with far more effectiveness because they're not using it to build, which when you build a structure, it takes up a certain amount of space. But when you use that same amount of money and plant olive trees or plant grapevines or plant mustard seed or plant all sorts of other things that grow quickly, you take over hundreds of dunams, even thousands of dunams at the same time. And the state of Israel is doing nothing to address this problem.
It also doesn't film well, right? A lot of times you see in the media the IDF uprooting, olive trees, this and that. And
it looks bad. It looks bad. And they also, much of the work that they do is infrastructure to enable these quote unquote local farmers, who of course are people who live in all sorts of places within the Palestinian Authority, are paid a salary to move into Area C and tend these new agricultural projects. They create water systems, they create electrical systems, they pave roads in order to service all of this. And then villages, quote unquote, ancient, historic Palestinian villages that never existed before last week, pop up all around these projects. So it's a very effective tactic. A third tactic that we've recently published an extensive report on is illegal school buildings. And this is also a public relations nightmare for the state of Israel and a win-win for the Palestinian Authority. They build a school. We have documented 100 illegal schools in Area C. Most of them only a few hundred meters away from existing schools in areas that are Israeli state land, sometimes within the blue lines of existing Jewish communities, sometimes on archaeological sites, sometimes in nature reserves. And then a community grows up around it. So when the state of Israel finally gathers up its wits and knocks down a school, you have terrible pictures of crying children and wailing mothers and an international uproar over the cruel, oppressive Israeli regime that is denying underprivileged children an education, where in fact, all of these children had a school that they were learning in within the Palestinian Authority. The population, the density of students per classroom in the Palestinian Authority is among the lowest anywhere in the region. It's much lower than the density in Israeli schools, in Jordanian schools, anywhere. They obviously don't need these school buildings. They are a political tool with which the territory is being annexed.
Now, in addition to the de facto Palestinian state they're trying to establish, what effect does this have on the actual residents of Judea and Samaria, the Jews that live in the communities? Do they feel this? Do they feel that they're being enclosed in upon and that the Palestinian Authority is tightening the noose, so to speak? Is that a feeling that people feel?
They're beginning to wake up. Unfortunately, for far too long, Israeli residents of Judea and Samaria had no idea what was going on around them. One of our major goals is to raise awareness within the areas themselves that are being threatened. When people in Efrat look out their window and they see someone planting olive trees, which is essentially on their back fence of their yard, they say, oh, how nice, the municipality is finally doing some gardening work. And they don't realize that the Palestinian Authority has taken over their backyard. They don't realize that the Palestinian Authority also has a massive land registry project underway where they're surveying and creating a land registry, ownership of state land. And no one's contesting it on the Israeli side. The state of Israel stopped the process of registration and regulation of land in 1968 and has never really resumed it because it would be construed as an act of sovereignty. The Palestinian Authority knows this full well. And they are carrying out all these acts that would be construed as, and they're saying out loud, plain as day, we are the sovereign. We will be the sovereign. This is an act of sovereignty. We are registering this land. And because there's no competing land registry on the Israeli side, when these cases come to court, this is the land registry that exists. We're allowing them to essentially dictate the terms of sovereignty in Judea and Samaria by doing nothing.
Now, a lot of what you've been saying is very applicable to Khan al-Ahmar. A lot of people are probably familiar with the name Khan al-Ahmar. Now it's Sheikh Jarrah, but before this was Khan al-Ahmar, and right, it sort of switches every few months. So,
yes.
Do you mind explaining a little bit more about what is this Khan al-Ahmar, this famous thing, and why is it so important, and also what's the EU and the European governments involved?
When I take foreign diplomats or journalists out to actually see Khan al-Ahmar, they're really quite surprised that this massive international incident is so unimpressive on the ground. But Khan al-Ahmar is really, it's the emblem, it's the flagship. We call it the flagship outpost of the Fayad Plan. In 2009, an Italian NGO built a school in what had been, up to that point, a collection of temporary shacks, huts, whatever you want to call it, just on land that is within the municipal lines of the Jewish community of Kfar Adumim, literally adjacent to Route 1. Now, no matter what country you live in, if there's a highway and it's called Route 1, you can probably guess that it's kind of an important highway. This is a strategically crucial area. It stands really at the axis, north, south, east, west of the country, and will create contiguity for whoever controls that piece of territory. So the Palestinian Authority, as soon as the Fayad Plan was launched in 2008, took a map and said, okay, what are the points on this map that we have to control in order to create the backbone for a Palestinian state? And Khan al-Ahmar was number one. All through the E1 area, connecting Jerusalem to the Dead Sea, all along Route 1, the main highway, they created outposts in a very simple and ingenious fashion. They provided the only thing really that Bedouin, the most mobile and most vulnerable population, actually need in order to stay in one place, and that is water. The Bedouin move from place to place in order to seek water with the seasons. So if they provide water, the Bedouin won't move, they'll stay right there. So actually in 2011 at Khan al-Ahmar, Salam Fayad made this bombastic speech about the evolving Palestinian state and said that the Bedouin are the foot soldiers of Palestinian independence, and Khan al-Ahmar is the capital, the capstone of this effort. So Khan al-Ahmar is at the moment somewhere around 80 people, and I'm talking give or take estimates go anywhere from 80 to 120. Some say people, some say families, some say clans. It's all outrageous, and it gets, as obviously there's an inflation of all this. Who lives there? So there's a Bedouin clan called Jahalin that migrated up into the Judean desert in the 1950s because of a feud within the clan, a very large clan. The rest of the clan stayed down in the Arad area and eventually became citizens of the state of Israel. But the ones that had broken off and come up into the Judean desert are now actually subjects of the Palestinian Authority. They were nomadic and were in the Judean desert area from the 1950s. And only in the 1980s, this particular cluster began to take shape. The people who lived there worked in the Jewish communities around there. That's why they were there. They found employment. They had income. Many of them worked in the, just as a side, a funny BDS story, they worked in the bagel factory, which the BDS movement eventually forced to leave the area. So all these people lost their source of livelihood. That's talk for another day.
That's how it goes.
But the people who live in Khan al-Ahmar have been threatened by the Palestinian Authority in recent years, and there was recently another expose of this problem. They're willing, even eager, to come to an agreement with the state of Israel to relocate and to live normal lives. The Palestinian Authority is using them as pawns. The European Union is using them as pawns in order to control this very strategic point on the map. Now, going back all the way to the first permanent structure that was built there, Regavim went to court. The residents of Kfar Adumim realized when a permanent structure hit the ground that they had a problem, that these Bedouin who were peacefully camped out on their land weren't intending to relocate as the seasons changed. So they asked us for assistance. We did what we always do, and that is we researched. We found all of the legal documentation. We found all of the aerial photos going back as far as we could to prove that there had never been a Bedouin encampment there before the 1980s, that there were no structures there, there was no village there, these people have no rights. They actually never claimed to own the property. They never claimed to have any rights. But the Palestinian Authority has turned this into a cause célèbre. And Angela Merkel has threatened the state of Israel, the European Union, the International Criminal Court. It's become a monster. And it's become a monster because the civil administration in the state of Israel failed to enforce the law against it when it was small. So although it has grown quite a lot in size, it has grown exponentially in terms of its notoriety. And once again, the state of Israel now says, plain as day, it's still there because of diplomatic pressure. And the state of Israel is failing to behave like a sovereign. And if Khan al-Ahmar is not removed, which is clearly illegal and in 6 separate rounds of Supreme Court hearings has been proven to be illegal, and the Supreme Court has given the military a green light to remove it and to relocate the people who are there. And the state of Israel has created an alternative location for them, invested millions, built them an alternative school, paved roads, laid electricity on water lines. These people want to move, and the Palestinian Authority won't let them move. So it's a test case. It's an important case because it is a precedent for at least 80, probably more, illegal clusters, illegal outposts, really, of the Palestinian Authority in the same region, all of which are more or less created and maintained with European Union money.
So you just explained how Israel built them an alternative place with infrastructure, electricity, water. Mm-hmm. Now they're sort of right on the highway and the kids could just wander off. Yet the EU and all the European governments fund this. Do you think that it comes from a place of being naive, or more of just from a sinister place of this is a Jewish state, we're going to get them? What do you think the European Union, all these, Angela Merkel, outgoing Chancellor of Germany, and all the other leaders of state think when they wake up in the morning and they give these addresses on little tiny places in Israel?
We like to believe that that is because they're naive. So as a matter of fact, 2 years ago, I and Meir Deutsch, the Director General of Regavim, and Yachim Zik, the Director of Operations, we took ourselves off to Brussels and we met with a group of, individually, a large number of European parliamentarians to see if it was a question of naivete, to show them the facts, to present this situation. Some of them were quite shocked. Some of them were quite shocked that the millions, tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of euros that could be better spent in Europe is going to create facts on the ground and create a situation in which, even if you say, let's create a Palestinian state, a two-state solution through negotiation, creating these facts on the ground means that there can be no negotiation. So essentially they're working against their own stated purposes. Some of them were quite shocked. I believe that it's a self-selecting group because the ones who didn't agree to meet with us were the ones who are most vocal and most involved in very clearly what is not a naive program. It is a program of creating a Palestinian state and completely circumventing Jewish sovereignty in the state of Israel and in the land of Israel. So it's an unfortunate combination. Part of what we do is to raise awareness of the facts and to point out the illegality of all of this according to the EU's own charter, according to international law. And the problem that we have at this point is the state of Israel, not necessarily the Europeans. Because if the state of Israel would stand up and behave like a mature, sovereign nation and demand that its rights be respected, perhaps that would make an impression on some of our friends in Europe who right now are silent because they don't really know what to believe anymore. If the state of Israel doesn't protest, why should we?
Now, what you're describing seems very similar to what anyone could plainly see in the Negev in southern Israel. I mean, if you're driving just around Beersheba, you look in the side of the road, you just see dozens and hundreds of these Bedouin encampment. Is this situation, including the European funding, also happening in the Negev?
The situation in the Negev is very different. So first, bottom line that you have to start from when you discuss the Negev is, number one, this is sovereign Israel. The people who we're talking about in the Negev are Israeli citizens. They have full rights as Israeli citizens. Unfortunately, they aren't held to the same full responsibilities as the rest of Israeli citizens. The situation in the Negev is extremely complex because the Bedouin population that lives there has certain claims that it has presented or failed to present, and that's part of the problem, to the official land registrar that was made available to them for over a decade to present any and all documentation for their ownership claims of land in the Negev. So the state of Israel, let's take a step back and look at history a bit. When the state was, after 1948, there were somewhere in the area of 11,000 Bedouin in the Negev. Many of the Bedouin who had been there before did what Bedouin do when things get dicey. They left. They picked themselves up and moved into what at the time was under Jordanian control in Judea and Samaria. Some went down to the Gaza Strip. Some traveled further into Jordan. Some went up north through Lebanon and Syria. Only a small number stayed. Now, recall that until the day after the War of Independence, the war that we were fighting was a war of Arabs versus Jews. Not Bedouin, not Palestinian, all the Arabs. The Bedouin in the Negev, most of them, the vast majority, were hostile combatants. So the state of Israel, when it was finally established, created a military governorship to figure out what to do with these populations that had been hostile combatants until that time. Military rule continued in the north of the country for a very short time. At that time, the Arabs in the north were encouraged to present any and all documentation of their property ownership. And they had documents of those kinds because they were living closer to organized settlements or organized countries. So they had Ottoman land deeds, Turkish land deeds, they had Jordanian land deeds, they had Syrian land deeds, they had all sorts of things. They had mandatory deeds. So all of that property was registered by law to them, and they are the owners. The vast majority of land in the Arab communities in the north of Israel is owned privately by the Arab people who were here at the time. The Negev is very, very different. So military rule continued until 1966, at which time the State of Israel said this is no longer a necessity. These people are all here and they're staying here, and they were given full citizenship and were given rights to claim their property. They had no documentation. Being Bedouin, the Bedouin tradition is you don't own land, the land owns you. So they had no documentation, they had no land deeds, they had never paid taxes on any of this land, even though they were encouraged to do so both by the Ottoman Empire, the mandatory powers, the Jordanians, and they never did. So they still clung to these land claims. The State of Israel said, well, let's do something else. We can't really provide services to tens of thousands of people. At the time, it was tens of thousands of people who are living and are full citizens. Let's create organized communities in which we can deliver services, education, welfare, healthcare, electricity, water, everything that you and I have come to expect our government to provide. So they created townships, legal, organized townships, and encouraged the Bedouin to move in. The problem was that they made the mistake of creating these townships. They made two fatal mistakes. One is they built some of these towns on land that the Bedouin claimed, that individual Bedouin claimed to own. And according to Bedouin law, if one Bedouin claims to own a piece of land, no one else can live on it. So they refused to move in. Another problem was that these towns were created without sensitivity to intertribal tensions in the Bedouin communities. There are certain clans and certain tribes that cannot live together. They have a very violent history, and the State of Israel failed to take that into account. So these townships only at present house some 1/3 of the people that they should. Many of the Bedouin who live outside of these townships still have claims to land. They refuse to leave the land they're squatting on because they're afraid that they'll end up between the rock and the hard place if they give up where they're standing and they take the government's increasingly generous offers of compensation. They will end up in that gap in between and end up with nothing. So we have created, Regavim has been involved in the Negev, in analyzing the situation in the Negev and coming up with practical solutions for 16 years since our inception. We have a very detailed, very carefully crafted, comprehensive plan for solving the problems of the Negev and land use issues, ownership claims. And parts of it have already, the government has begun to understand that this is the only way forward. So I encourage anyone who's interested in that to have a look at it. But in the meantime, all of this situation where the State of Israel has failed to protect land resources in the Negev has resulted in a lot of other problems that we've been forced to address. For example, the situation that I think people are much more aware of now than they have been in the past, but is just as bad as it always was, and that is the complete lawlessness in these illegal squatters' camps in the Negev. The violence and the protection schemes and the tax evasion and the abuse and all sorts of things that go with living under the radar.
And it spills over also into all the Jewish towns. And
of course, the entire country is affected. It's costing, first of all, it's costing the economy of the entire State of Israel millions, hundreds of millions. There's massive tax fraud. There's massive bituach leumi fraud, national social welfare. Another issue that we had to become involved in because we began to see that this population, which is the fastest growing population on earth, was expanding onto more and more of Israel's land reserves. Again, the Negev is it's over 70% of Israel's available land reserves for future growth are in the Negev. And it's disappearing. It's disappearing rapidly. So we began to try to figure out how and why. And we began to understand that the practice of polygamy in the Negev, which is against the law and has been against the law in Israel and has never been enforced, it's a massive problem. It's not only a social problem because the children who are born into this sort of situation suffer from neglect and disenfranchisement. And this is what leads to rampant crime and violence. And unfortunately, in recent years, terrorism. It's created this feeling of disenfranchisement has also pushed more and more people towards more radical forms of Islam. It has radicalized the community in general. Also, the women who are being brought in to fuel this polygamy, the practice of polygamy, are coming from far more radical communities, either within the Palestinian Authority, from Gaza, from Jordan, from Egypt, all over the place. And they're importing with them all of the anti-Israel sentiment that was not a problem among Bedouin traditionally in the Negev, and now is a massive problem. So all of these things are outgrowths of what we found in terms of the land use policy and Israel's failure to protect our most vital, most basic resource in the Negev, which is the land itself.
Now, where does the Kamenetz law come into place? When they were forming the coalition, that was one of the things that kept on coming up. But I don't think especially people who don't live in Israel, have trouble really grasping what it is. Can you explain a little more about that?
I'll be happy to. It's another area. It's essentially one of our main areas of focus at Regavim. The Kamenetz law is essentially a set of amendments to Israel's planning and construction code. Very simply put, for many, many years, crime was made by the Israeli government's failure to amend the law. Crime paid. So if you built an illegal structure, and the only inducement to obey the law that the planning laws had in them was something like a 50 lira fine. So you built it, you paid the 50 lira fine, and I'm talking about a pittance. And then you had all these apartments and you sold them and you had this illegal construction and nobody enforced the law. So we spent years tracking what the problem was, where the enforcement broke down, and we began to understand that the Israeli construction and planning law had no enforcement. It had no enforcement clauses at all. So we sat for years. We formulated solutions. We actually entered into dialogue with Deputy Attorney General Erez Kamenetz, who was put in charge of revamping Israel's construction and planning code, after we presented over and over and over again what the problems were and how we recommended solving them. So eventually, a set of amendments, Amendment 116 really, which had a whole bunch of enforcement clauses, was ratified and became law. And in the 1 year after this set of amendments was enforced, illegal construction in the state of Israel nationwide was reduced by 50%. It's a very effective tool. When you make crime not pay, people don't commit the crime. From the day that it was passed, from the day that it was even formulated, the Arab parties have been fighting against it. And they claim, and they have claimed over and over again, that this is a racist law. Now, it is clearly not a racist law. That is a ridiculous claim. It is applicable to every single citizen of the state of Israel equally. Not coincidentally, the ones who are affected by it most are the ones who build illegally the most. And the illegal construction in Arab communities, particularly in the north of the country, but also elsewhere, is rampant. And so these people are the ones who are most affected and most threatened by actual enforceable law that makes crime not pay. So claiming that it's racist is ridiculous. But the Arab parties actually used the present political situation as a means of suspending enforcement of the Kamenetz law. They tried to have it repealed. They've tried to have it repealed over and over and over again, and luckily have not succeeded. Unfortunately, they're still at it, but they managed to bargain a 2-year moratorium of enforcement on existing illegal structures. So new illegal structures are still subject to the Kamenetz law, and they're trying to change that as well. If the Kamenetz law is repealed, we will go back with a vengeance. It will be even worse to the absolute chaos of illegal construction that makes it impossible to provide services and to plan for the future for the residents of those same Arab communities. They're the ones who are suffering the most from all this illegal construction. So, for example, the state of Israel wants to modernize and wants to bring higher level services to the north of the country. Along Route 6, along the Trans-Israel Highway, they left a national infrastructure corridor. That corridor was supposed to have new gas lines for natural gas, higher powered electricity lines, much more advanced communication lines, fiber optic cables, all the things that the modern state of Israel gives to its citizens. That national infrastructure corridor in the north of Israel, leading north, backs onto a series of Arab communities. And it is now no longer an empty corridor. It is completely chock-a-block with illegal construction. So if you don't enforce the law, who's going to suffer? The people in those communities who aren't going to get the fiber optic cables and the higher powered electricity and the better water and sewage lines, etc., etc. Enforcing the law is, at the bottom line, the way to ensure equality of opportunity for these communities, advancement, infrastructure, all the things that the Arab parties claim Israel, for racial reasons, is not providing. Well, it's not a racist issue. Problem is, laws are there to protect all of us, and they're there to ensure a better future for everyone who lives in this country. And failure to enforce the law is not doing anyone a favor. So you have to stop being afraid of being called a racist, and you have to enforce the law equally and universally. That is what Regavim is all about.
I want to, first of all, this is enlightening and very frightening as well. I think everyone watching this is also going to come out of this, but very optimistic as well, because we have Regavim. I want to ask just one question before we go. I want to take it back to the Palestinian Authority and their illegal building in Judea and Samaria. I want to ask what impact does this have on the environment, on archaeological sites? Because there's no oversight. It's lawlessness. They do whatever they want.
It's worse than no oversight. The Palestinian Authority has, you mentioned archaeological sites, the Palestinian Authority has targeted sites that are the physical proof of Jewish history in Judea and Samaria, and is decimating them systematically, giving permits to local farmers to actually farm or plow over sites thousands of years old. Massive destruction. In addition, there's also a massive problem of archaeological theft and a very, very, very busy black market in all kinds of archaeological finds, because there is tremendous plunder that is destroying these sites and robbing us of the physical heritage of Judea and Samaria. They're not doing anything about it. Now, this was a problem that was actually foreseen in some ways, because in the Oslo Accords themselves, there are stipulations for particular sites that are of importance to Jewish history that are within the Palestinian Authority's areas of jurisdiction, and they were required by the Oslo Accords not only to protect and preserve these places, but to allow access to them. Needless to say, it didn't happen. It never happened. Needless to say, these sites, I think, are the most endangered, even though they are listed as in international treaties. In addition to those, there are hundreds of sites, many hundreds of sites throughout Judea and Samaria that are evaporating before our eyes. They're being systematically. We had a case where we took documentation of Palestinian Authority's activities at Sebastia, for example, the ancient capital of the kingdom of Israel. The UNESCO, the international organization, the arm of the UN entrusted with protecting archaeological sites and sites of world history, funded a project that destroyed part of the fortress there, part of the site at Sebastia, created a Palestinian visitor center, redefined the entire site as a Palestinian heritage site. There is no longer any mention of Jewish history at the site. They said it was part of an ancient kingdom. Don't say which one. It's a massive problem. The problem is also the Sebastia as an example. Part of the site is in Area B. Part of it is in Area C. But even the part that's in Area C, the State of Israel has failed to protect. So we documented what was going on there. We ran to the civil administration. We ran to the Antiquities Authority, the officer of the civil administration. The Israel Antiquities Authority obviously has no jurisdiction over the Green Line. It's a massive problem. The State of Israel has to do something, and it has to demand of the Palestinian Authority And it has to also demand of international organizations and international governments. The Belgian government, for example, is extremely involved in the Sebastia site. They were guests of honor at the inauguration of the Palestinian Heritage Center at Sebastia. The destruction that's going on throughout Judea and Samaria it's tragic. It's irreplaceable, obviously. It is our heritage, and it is the first thing that the Palestinian Authority aims to erase. We have a lot of work to do.
Yeah. So again, this is very enlightening and very concerning at the same time. Lastly, how could people help?
How do people help? So first of all, get educated. Follow what we put out and share it. We hope that people will donate so that we can get more people out in the field, get more documentation, file more petitions. We can also create more awareness among European, American, and other foreign diplomats. The only way we can do that is actually go and meet with them, show them the facts, take them out to the field when we can, and show them what's going on, because they're unaware. The foreign diplomats are unaware. In addition to that, we need pressure. We need pressure on the Israeli government. We need the Israeli government really to understand that if it behaves like a sovereign, it will have the backing of the people of Israel and Jews worldwide. Not to be afraid, because if Israel doesn't speak up for itself, we're in trouble.
Thank you very much again. I really appreciate you coming in to talk.
Thank you. I can give you our website information, so we're very easy to find, I hope. Our English language media, our website has all of our research papers, maps, documentation, an entire legal library, only in Hebrew though, of all of our Supreme Court cases, all of our court cases, not only Supreme Court, and is very, very friendly in terms of organizing things by issues, by areas. We updated it several times a week. It's Regavim, ENG, English. Our Facebook page, our Twitter account, all of these things are very, very active. We also have a new Telegram channel that just notifies people when there's actually action points, either a public hearing that they can attend, or a demonstration, or a new case that's coming up, or really just action oriented. So all of those things are very helpful. And of course, donations, either directly through our website or through Negev, online secure donations in any currency, and it will help us get more people out on the ground, get more documentation, and create more legal, the contra to the lawfare that is being waged against Israel from our side.
Well, again, thank you very much for coming to talk, and keep up the great and important work.
Thank you.